As always, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. Conventional strategy used to have specific rules. When the game was largely about occupying markets in the physical world and dominating over companies doing the same thing you were, how we used to think about competition, you duked it out with existing structures. Now, with the advent of a digital world, AI, and dematerialization, you win by changing the structures themselves. You could even say reshuffling them. One of today's guests wrote the book The End of Competitive Advantage, which highlighted the birth of Transient Advantage, a business strategy stating that companies' edges are very short-lived. Our other guest wrote a book called Reshuffle, Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. So, kind of like Reese's Pieces, I mashed these two things together, and it makes me wonder, are we seeing the end of Transient Advantage, or are we seeing a doubling down of certain advantages? So before we attack those questions, let me first welcome not only friends of the show, but two people who have become friends of my own. First, the lady who never sits still. She just brought into the world a grandchild, and now she's bringing in a new child in a new book. And she doesn't sit on the laurels of her massive success and her hit books. She's just written a new book, which we'll hear a little bit about today. Welcome to the show, as always, Rita McGrath.
Pleasure to be here, Aidan.
Always a pleasure, Rita. And a gent who recently won the Thinkers50 Award for Strategy for his work on platforms, and then his hit book, Reshuffle, that many of us have studied over time. And he will give us a sneak peek not only into his new book, not Reshuffle Part 2, but the man who calls the innovation show the idea sommelier, the fine wine himself, Sangeet Paul Choudary. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aidan. So good to be back.
It's great to have you, man. And I looked everywhere for white gloves to treat you to fine wines with the respect you deserve. But I thought we'd begin with some definitions. I thought we'd take a little lesson from your book, Rita, which I wish I had 10 years ago, The Entrepreneurial Mindset, where you talk about the idea of an assumptions map. So let's not let any assumptions go astray and assume people are on the same page. So let's give a whirlwind history of what got us here. Rita, you've talked before about the theory of the growth of the firm. The late Edith Penrose, the current collaborator of yours, Carlota Perez, her work plays an important role in understanding longer term cycles. So I'd love you to give us a whirlwind history of what got us to today, and then maybe where we are today, and then what's reshuffling it later, Sangeet can talk about.
Sure, I'll try to make it concise. So if you think about the field of strategy, it has its intellectual roots in a thing called industrial economics. And industrial economics makes two assumptions that I would argue, I believe Sangeet would agree, in today's environment are just kind of absurd. The first assumption is that there is such a thing as an industry with clearly defined boundaries, and that the most significant competition you'll face comes from within that industry. And the second assumption is that the normal state of things is equilibrium. Because if you're an economist, you love equilibrium, and you can derive all your fancy formulas from that. So if you relax those two assumptions, what that creates is a very different world. And so if I were to go all the way back to Edith Penrose, who was very interested in how firms actually grow, and unlike most economists of her time, she actually talked to people and studied what firms did. And what she articulated was that firms would have a success, they'd accumulate some slack resources, and then entrepreneurially minded managers would go off and look for new areas to deploy those resources. And that was what caused firms to grow. And that firms themselves were unique in that their paths were path dependent and idiosyncratic. So even if you wanted to copy a firm, unless you've gone on that same journey, it would be very difficult for you to do so. So moving forward, what I started to look at back in the 90s was this phenomena of transient advantage. And my first book, Entrepreneurial Mindset, was about, well, what do you do when advantages don't last? And when the most significant competitors you face are not even in your industry. And so that book was, how do we teach companies to behave like habitual entrepreneurs? The next book was Market Busters, which was, where do we look for opportunities? Then Discovery Driven Growth was, how do we make all this systematic? And A Competitive Advantage, as you said, Aidan, was really about this transient advantage phenomena and how we need to have a new playbook for strategy. And then the most recent one, Seeing Around Corners, was, well, if advantages are transient, what are the signals in the environment you need to be paying attention to? Now, the new one is really looking at what I believe to be this massive transition. And I think Sangeet will agree as well, which is we're really going from this system of physical things, mass production, suburbs and appliances, and, basically a robust middle class, to a system which has yet to be defined. We know some of what its contours are, but we know that the mass market paradigm is not going to be the one that works for this future system. So Carlota Perez is a researcher and economic historian, so people call her, and she studied this and said, we've been down this path before with capitalism. And what happens is an old regime, namely in our situation, the mass market phenomena, loses its ability to continue to drive growth. Capital goes looking for the next big thing. When it thinks it finds it, capital goes flowing and creating a bubble or a series of bubbles. But anyway, what happens is eventually the bubble comes to an end. Capital, which has been gaily operating in kind of a casino environment, it sort of sobers up. And if we play our cards right, we can get capital aligned with production, we can reduce income inequality, and we get to what Carlota calls a golden age. And she's argued we've done this 5 times already before. So we both, Carlota and I both, believe that we're at this turning point. It has all the hallmarks of a classic turning point: massive inequality, populism, people feeling, quite rightly, we played by the rules and the rules changed on us and we feel we're being treated unfairly. And on top of all that, now the substrate of what we're doing is creating digital inputs, which are general purpose. So Carlota was talking about GPT long before we knew about AI. But as oil was cheap and ubiquitous and everywhere in the previous regime, today data, information, and intelligence are that in our current regime. So that kind of brings us to where we are.
The concept of capabilities is an important one as well. Maybe before we come to Sangeet, the systems thinker himself, maybe we'll talk about that, because capabilities will open up later in the conversation. The idea of playing to different rules, being a rule maker, being a rule taker, what arena you play in as well, which is something that you talk about a lot in your work.
So I define a corporate capability or competence as equivalent to a human skill. So typing, for example. And when you first start, you're not going to be very good. And then as you gain practice and get better, eventually you get to the point where it's so natural you don't even realize you're making an effort to type. So a capability in a corporate context is the ability to increasingly achieve what you set out to. And in my own dissertation, what I studied was where these things come from. So it starts off with understanding what's driving what, which would be sort of discovery-driven planning. How are you converting assumptions to knowledge? Then you build a team that gets better and better over time. Now, in the beginning, they're going to be terrible because they don't know what they're doing, literally. As these things start to work together, you start to see the emergence of new competences or new capabilities, some of which are distinctive. And some of those distinctive competences can create a competitive advantage. And Sangeet, I would love a different word. Because it's not advantage over competition. It's gaining rents from the environment that you alone can access. And I don't know how to describe that succinctly. But anyway, to me, a competitive advantage has 3 necessary conditions. So you have to get the market enthusiastic about it. So somebody's got to be willing to pay you for this. You got to get your company enthusiastic about this. And we have this myth in our heads that something that's beloved by the market is going to be beloved by your firm. No, not necessarily. Your sister divisions may not be set up to support and endorse you. And then you've got to have some kind of competitive insulation. Otherwise, people will copy you. So that's the growth path of a competitive advantage.
Sangeet opens you up perfectly, because recently I had the amazing honor to host Carlos Baldwin and Kim Clark on the book Design Rules. And what I really learned about it, also with the work of Rebecca Henderson, was that you create those capabilities that Rita talked about. You're terrible at them. Then you create the firm based on those capabilities, and you inadvertently create silos inside the company. And then that informs all future products going out of the company because they become kind of a mirror of the organizational setup. And they need to be reshuffled in an age of AI, or not that they need to be, but they have to be. They have no choice as the organization. So I always see your work as a systems thinker in action, and actually the growth of your work through platforms as well to where you are today. But I thought it was important to talk about something that's a huge shift from a physical world where we created physical products to a digital world, which is the idea of a network effect and a digital platform. I'd love, before you get stuck in on where you see strategy is today and that idea of rule maker, rule taker, to describe to us the idea of a network effect and what a digital platform is.
Yeah, absolutely. So my first body of work was focused on explaining digital platforms and network effects. But really what we saw with digital platforms back in, you know, the 2010s and what we're seeing with AI right now, there's something underlying both of them which is very similar. And that is that whenever you have a shift in technology because of which previous bottlenecks get removed, you start seeing a fundamental restructuring of the landscape. I won't even use the term industry to Rita's point. You start seeing a restructuring of the system. And so the last time around, the most interesting set of shifts that brought this together was the convergence of the smartphone, data, and the cloud capabilities, and to some extent, the social graph. All these four things coming together gave us what we now think of as the platform economy. Now, the reason that's interesting is that before that convergence happened, the shift to online had already happened quite some time back, but the mental models we had all through were very much channel-based mental models or artifact-based mental models. We are focused on transforming the artifact from the store to the website, from offline to online. And we even looked at, say, a Netflix versus Blockbuster as well. Netflix is going online, Blockbuster was offline. Fundamentally, we were missing the fact all through that when technological shifts play out, they allow a fundamentally new way to restructure the system. I'll just give a simple example which happened even before the smartphones. So take Netflix as an example, right? Both Blockbuster and Netflix were delivering DVDs offline and through physical logistics. But what really separated the two was the fact that Netflix had a data-driven inventory management system, which allowed it to predict demand at national scale. Because as customers were queuing which DVDs they wanted to get access to, they were giving the signals to Netflix in terms of where they could move DVDs across the country. And what that helped Netflix do was it allowed them to convert what was previously a local market, because Blockbuster, you had local supply serving local demand. Even if the movie was available 40 miles away, you would not drive all the way to get it. You were still being served by stores in your vicinity. Netflix, because it could move inventory at national scale, was able to serve local demand with national supply. And it's simply impossible for a local demand, local supply economic model to compete with that for a variety of reasons, right? And that essentially is what enabled Netflix to compete or to fundamentally create a model that Blockbuster simply could not copy. It could copy the removal of late fees, it could copy going online, it could simply not copy this model of serving local demand with national inventory. Now, the reason all of these things are important is because when we started seeing the convergence of smartphone, social, cloud, and data, we started getting the ability to create global markets which could be orchestrated using a central brain, which is what data allowed, and which could have trust embedded in them thanks to social technologies improving. And so that led to the rise of companies like Airbnb, Uber, and so on. And what we saw as the dominant model across all of this was that the firm was no longer creating products and services and selling it to the customer in the traditional linear model, which is what I call the pipeline model. The firm now is creating the rules and the tools for the market to come together and transact with each other. But the other thing that the firm was doing was that it was changing the distinction between who was a rule taker and who was a rule maker. Traditionally, the regulator was the rule maker, and companies competing in the market were the rule takers. And the structures within which they competed, the industry structures that we're talking about, used to be very fixed, very clearly defined. And what started happening first with the smartphone, and with data, because with both of these things, you could now easily cross industry boundaries. The smartphone allowed the customer journey to cross different industry boundaries. Data allowed capabilities to cross different industry boundaries. And because of that, you now had this convergence where the rule making of these new arenas was up for grabs. And so that created the distinction between who could make the rules and who could take the rules. So you had Uber, Airbnb, Google, Facebook, all of these companies emerging as rule makers, eventually the platform companies, and everybody participating in their ecosystems were the rule takers. That brings us to this idea of network effects. The fundamental idea of network effects is that once you provide the tools and the rules, because you are making the rules, others are taking them, and you organize demand and supply around yourself, you start benefiting from network effects, not because you've aggregated the market, but because you aggregated them in a way that they subscribe to your rules. And hence, the more they engage with your governance mechanism, the more they play by your rules, the more value gets created on that basis, the more it becomes difficult for somebody else to displace you. And that is essentially what we saw with the rise of platform business models.
Beautiful. Beautiful job. I want to just double click on one thing you said there, because it speaks to what Rita calls an arena. So what arena do you play in? And that's why I love doing this work. I think the work that we do is to give people a new set of lenses. Our mutual friend Scott Anthony told me that Clayton Christensen's wife Christine used to joke with him that his glasses had an S-curve built into them, and his disruptive innovation model was in there, and he saw everything through that lens. And it stuck with me as this concept that when we give an organization a new lens through the work that you do, that we all do in this field, they can see advantages that they have sitting right in front of them. And
Right.
The reason I mention that is sometimes organizations, lots of which you've worked with, don't see the oil, to Rita's point, that could be data sitting right in front of them, some capability that they've built, that if they see it through the new lens, they could unlock it. And I think bringing them this work and bringing them these new concepts, the books that you write, is a way to unlock that. And Rita, I'd love you both to share an example of when you've seen that in play, because I really want to make this relevant to people to go, oh, that's not just talking about Airbnb and Uber. Airbnb was a physical product in the first place. And eventually either they realized, or some consultant or something they read unlocked a new way of seeing their business, and it became a platform, or they saw it as a platform. I'd love you to share that as an encouragement for people to see that this is relevant to you, and so much so in this age of AI.
Absolutely. Before I go there, though, Sangeet, I was at an investor conference not too long ago, and there was an investment advisor there who said he had always bet against Netflix. And we all looked at it in horror, and we said, why would you bet against Netflix? They're so great. He said, I never thought the movie studios would be stupid enough to provide them with all that content. And I think it really reinforces your point about where the choke points are, because if you look at it very narrowly, right, what the movie studios were all saying was, whoa, all this new revenue from old libraries of content, which we are not monetizing anymore because they've already gone through their life cycle with it. We're in the movies, then they were on TV, then they were on reruns, and they're just sitting there now, but we're not monetizing them. And Netflix said, oh, here's a whole new revenue stream if you license them to us. And this guy was saying, I can't believe anybody would be so stupid to allow this competitor to emerge in a market with it, would eventually destabilize that power transition.
Something I learned from you was then Netflix didn't rest on their laurels. They saw the threat. And they went, actually, we need our own competitive advantage here, which is our own content.
Absolutely. To make it really concrete, I run a course at Columbia called Leading Strategic Growth and Change. And as part of that course, each participant prepares what we call a personal case, which is some situation or dilemma or problem that they're facing, and they write it up. And then we put them in small groups and every day they work with their groups on making progress on their case. Now, they may not get to its solution, but almost always they have their assumptions challenged. They think about whether they define the problem accurately or not. And one of the participants in that course was a guy who was in the seed and fertilizer business. sensible enough, right? And the problem he came into the course with was, well, how do I include, better seed and fertilizer combinations, and was wrestling with it. And about halfway through the course, the light bulb went off in his head. And he said, wait a minute. I'm not in the seed and fertilizer business. I'm actually in the information business, because through the business of selling these seeds and fertilizers, I have all this information about the quality of the soil and which plants respond best and how best to deal with weeds. And that information actually has huge value to local townships and environmental regulators and people that are concerned about, are we overusing the soil, and all kinds of things. And he left the case, and you'd be very proud of his Sangeet. He left the course with the idea of creating indeed a platform on that basis. Another example is the leading hotels of the world. Same sort of scenario. They came into my course, and the original idea was, well, how do we make this collection? And these are unique individual hotel properties. And Ted Tang, who was in my course, said, oh, what we really need to create is a platform for these hotels so that there's this commonality that a guest would experience, even though they're all very different. And so their tagline became every kind of one of a kind, which I thought was just so interesting, right?
Rita, I hope you got some contra on both of the garden and...
As an educator, we live on the reflected glory, right, Aidan?
Sangeet, speaking to that, one of the cases we spoke about recently was John Deere as a great example of that, to extend the idea of the garden. But I'd love you to share one that you've seen, again, just to encourage people to see what they do and the capabilities they've built through a different lens.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to call out is that very often executives discount the value of a lens and look for silver bullets. And this was my experience with this whole platform journey, right? A lot of companies would call me and they wanted to figure out if they were building a platform or not. And if they were building a platform, how is it different from one of the big tech platforms? And so it was all about, we've set this box as the winning box, and we need to figure out how we fit inside that box. And the question is really, you're not looking for a silver bullet. You're looking for a new way to navigate an uncertain landscape. And you're looking to understand, if the landscape is uncertain, how do I read it? And what are the few points at which I apply pressure, which then works in my favor, right? That's what you're essentially looking at. What kind of gives me that leverage? And if I go back to the Netflix example very briefly, what Netflix has done all through, and which is why anybody's bet against them has struggled, they've always looked for what is the new choke point that needs to be the least. Another example is Tesla, right? Tesla's North Star was always, this is an emerging industry. We need to get to maximum driving range. And in order to get to that driving range, we have to work with capabilities that are evolving very rapidly. So we need to figure out which capability is the bottleneck right now. Once we release that, what's the next one? And so if you look at Tesla's sort of strategy, if you will, right? During a time when everybody is talking about openness, platforms, etc., they were vertically integrated, because when capabilities are rapidly evolving, the only way to guarantee end user performance is to work across the full chain and figure out where the bottleneck is, attack it. Battery performance, go for it, attack it. Charger performance, go for it, attack it. Charger rollout, software, it's the integrated set that you have to attack. So the reason I'm saying all of this is that when I used to talk about platforms in the 2010s, this was the question that used to keep coming my way. If everybody's doing platforms, why is Tesla doing vertical integration? So the point again is, there are no silver bullets. You have to figure out what is the landscape you're playing in, what is required to play successfully in that landscape, and given the capability set that you have and you have access to, what is the best way in which you can orient yourself towards what that landscape has to offer? So that's really key. And you mentioned the John Deere example. I mean, there are many other cases, I would say, which are quite interesting. A client or a company that I worked with over the years, which is quite interesting, is this Norwegian newspaper company called Schibsted. So Schibsted Media Group, they came from the traditional newspaper business. And then when newspapers got unbundled, so the traditional bundle used to be content, classifieds, and advertising. And Google unbundled it, aggregated all the advertising towards itself. Content became commodity. So they decided, let's double down on classifieds. Pretty soon, with social, mobile, cloud, everything I talked about, the platform economy came in and they realized pure play classifieds doesn't work. We need marketplaces. So they moved into marketplaces, created a common ID and a common payments mechanism across all of that. And now some of the questions that they're looking at is, well, in the platform economy, there was the idea of a network effect. And if you were running a real estate marketplace, or if you were running, say, a used car marketplace, you had the benefit of the local network effect. So think again about the Blockbuster versus Netflix example. A real estate marketplace, a used car marketplace, these are all local network effect models. So it's very difficult for the global player to come in and get into your business. So Zillow might dominate in the US, but they won't easily come into Norway. All of those marketplaces are having a Netflix moment because a horizontal AI model trained in the US can come in and become a buyer side agent on real estate transactions, on mobility transactions in a European market. And so the traditional marketplace model unbundles, the network effect is no longer strong enough, and AI, or a horizontal AI player can either get trained in one market, move to others, or get trained in one vertical, move to others. As long as it represents the buyer side well, it is able to represent their participation across multiple markets. So again, the point I'm trying to make is this is an example of a traditional business, 150 years old or whatever, constantly looking at new lenses. And that's what we need. We can't say, well, network effects are the way to go, and then suddenly AI comes in and you're still applying the network effects model, because now you have a buyer side agent coming in and disrupting the network effect model. So that's the key point. Always look for what is the right lens with which you should be looking at the uncertainty you are facing. And, in business more than anything else, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So even if, we have this conversation and there are points where Rita and I may agree and there are points where we may not agree as much, it's because all models are wrong and some are useful. And I believe both the models that we bring here are useful in their own ways. And you have to figure out what's the model you should be applying to look at the uncertainty you're dealing with. So I think that's really what a lot of companies looking for silver bullets tend to miss. It's not so much, this is a big tech thing, we can't do it. It's more, we've been looking for a silver bullet, it didn't work, and now we're going the other direction saying that this does not work for us. So that's the wrong way to approach innovation.
I love that you said that. And, the silly arguments you often see about my framework, deliberate, emergent, whatever it might be, are often just the same person looking at the exact same thing with the lens that they have available to them. And it's ignorance by exclusion of the other framework half the time. That's one of the reasons I love doing the show. I love learning with witnesses, as you guys know. But I also think it's so important to just have that empathy to go, okay, well, what are you seeing and how are you defining that? Because the definition makes a huge difference to what you see. And I want to come to the definition of uncertainty itself, because you talk about the definition of uncertainty a firm is facing, Sangeet. But before I do, just on this idea of rule makers, rule takers, and regulation, I was thinking about this as you were speaking. And Rita, I know you again, work that you've done and you've collaborated with Carlota Perez. If I'm a regulator on a country level and I go, this firm is too big to fail, I need to bail it out. Or the opposite is that we don't have enough GDP coming in, the rules are changing, we have to deregulate in this area, like an Uber, for example, we have to let an Uber in, so we have to actually change how rules are done, etc. There's a pressure, call it an environmental pressure, on governments to change the rules as well as we go into this. And they too lack the lenses to see what's actually right in front of them. And they have some gold right there. They might see it as trash, but it's treasure. And I'd love you to maybe share what shift you see there. So, because a lot of people in regulation listen to the show, and I'd love you to share your perspectives.
I would love, if you have a policy role, I would love to be in touch with you, whatever level of policy you're at, because we are in this seismic shift. So we are going from a world where energy was cheap and materials were cheap and plentiful, and trade was fairly frictionless, and there were a known set of rules. And we're going into a world where, really, for our own good, energy should be expensive, materials should be expensive. There should be greater frictions between moving stuff around. So a couple of quick examples. Right now, we as a species, you spend more calories moving food around the world than we do actually consuming. So just to take a simple example, There are fisheries off of Norway that catch the fish, freeze it, send it to China, where it gets deboned, and then it gets sent back to markets like in the Nordics and in France. That's insane from a perspective of, you want to conserve energy and calories. That's just nuts. But right now we have a set of rules that make that economically attractive. So I think as politicians, we really have to think about what's the directionality, what we want to give capital. Because capital by and of itself, it's like a river. It's going to flow wherever the environment tells it to and wherever gravity goes. So it by itself does not have a moral imagination. So as a policymaker, what we ought to do, right, is think about how do we create more broadly shared prosperity? Because if all the billionaires control the wealth, we know from history that creates social instability, populism, and potential for far worse things. And we muffed it at the end of the 20s. What happened in 20s was there was this incredible advance in manufacturing capability. So we had actual mass market capability, but there was no corresponding demand. People didn't have money. And so you had all this excess capacity and at the same time, incredible poverty and deprivation. And it wasn't until they had Roosevelt's New Deal, the Second World War, and a group of people very intelligently sat down and said, what kind of rulers do we need so that we don't repeat the 30s over again? And out of that came the world order we currently are very familiar with. So the Bretton Woods Agreement, the Marshall Plan, which some people have described as the biggest bribe ever offered in history. But what that did was it rebuilt Europe. It created demand for American goods, and it created a fairly stable social bloc. You had the IMF, the World Bank. I mean, this whole structure that came out of that was all designed. But I think people forget that. It's what's the old line from Hamilton, right? I want to be in the room where it happens, not just assume that it happened. So policymakers, think about what would it take to make a lifestyle that's less asset intensive a term? What would it take to make energy actually reflect the true costs of burning? What would it take to be kinder to labor and harsher on pure investment terms? And those kinds of questions are the things I really encourage policymakers to think about. So, my expertise really is on corporations, a little bit on public policy, but I think there's a bunch of really rich conversations to be had. And what we know made that so successful in the post-World War period was it was government stepping up, but it was also business stepping. It was ordinary people putting pressure on needing certain things to work a certain way. And so the answer for the demand question is let's make the suburbs happen, right? And then when people can afford a house, let's create the 30-year mortgage. Let's build the highway infrastructure. That means then we'll need cars. And then those houses all have people in this, so they're going to need appliances. And it was just this really big creation of demand together with a broadening, a reduction in income inequality and a broadening of payments into ordinary people. Now, the parallel, right? So back then, these leaders said to themselves, we don't want to repeat the 30s. And there are going to be literally millions of men who are going to be demobilized. And we had just spent the last 4 years teaching them how to kill people. This is probably not a good situation if we don't have anything for them to do. So there was a real sense of urgency. And I think what you're seeing now is the beginning of that sense as well. You've got large numbers of people feeling very hard done by. You're starting to see, which I think is a really sad indicator, you're starting to see violence against business leaders. And Sam Altman just had a Molotov cocktail thrown on his porch. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that a large number feel that business is not working in their best interests. You had the murder of a healthcare CEO in broad daylight in New York. So, and business leaders and government leaders need to kind of pay attention to things that maybe they're not. Back to your idea of lens is maybe they're not normally thinking about this, but people are telling them very, very clearly this system is not working.
Thank you for saying that, Rita. And also, as an Irish person, thank you for your work on Irish policy that we're benefiting from today, but is absolutely transient and needs an update. Those policies need an update as well. Before we come to Sangeet on the same point for policies makers and what you're seeing, Sangeet, what you're seeing the really advanced thinkers out there from a country level are doing. I thought about what you said, Rita, about the idea of build the infrastructure. So in Ireland, we had a lot of our infrastructure built by overseas companies. So there were public-private partnerships. And I always see it as a metaphor for business. That Clay Christensen used to talk about this idea of the ship of Theseus, about outsourcing like Asus and Dell. Don't outsource too much because you won't have anything left, and that you'll give them all the competitive advantage. But that giving away of the crown jewels, it's such an important aspect as well from a metaphorical concept. Sangeet, maybe you'll share what you're seeing out there and the threats you're seeing as well.
Riffing off what you just said about outsourcing, because one of the issues with this whole question around outsourcing was that the easier lens to use around outsourcing was, is this operationally something that should be outsourced or can be outsourced? The more important lens should have been, is this strategically something that should be outsourced, in the sense that if I outsource this, will I enable the creation of capabilities outside? And we've sort of seen that with Apple in China and all of those things. And in recent cases where even the best companies fall prey to over outsourcing capabilities and building rival capabilities externally. And, all of this sort of comes back to looking at your competitive system, the system in which you're playing, with the right lens. Because going back to this point about the world we created in the latter half of the previous century, which was stable for a period of 40, 50 years or so, the post-war, all the way through globalization till digital happened, if you will. It was a fairly well-structured world with clear boundaries to industries, clear boundaries in terms of where you could meet the customer, how you could reach the customer, and how the customer could interact with the business, and so on. Which assets applied to which industries. There was a lot of asset specificity whenever there was assets around which you could create advantage. And in this scenario, the dominant uncertainty that firms faced was what I think of as operational uncertainty. It was the rules of the game were fixed. It was uncertainty within that. So you were playing the same game, but demand would fluctuate and you would have supply shocks. But fundamentally, the way your business worked, or more broadly, the phrase I would just use is rules of the game. The rules of the game were very fixed, right? Today, we're increasingly confronting structural uncertainty. This happened with the shift to digital and then to the platform economy, but even more so with AI. The big difference between what happened with platforms 15 years back versus what's happening with AI right now is that you are, the impact of technology is playing out not just at the level of structured interfaces between firms. It's playing out in workflows inside firms, in unstructured interfaces like negotiations and contracts and conversations between firms. All of those things which were traditionally beyond the impact of technology are now getting restructured. So for instance, if you deploy a sales agent to negotiate with your customer, or if you run procurement where an agent is working on your behalf, you have converted a previously tacit, unstructured interaction into a highly structured, learnable interaction, which changes where the value of the interaction accrues, whether to the procurement manager at that point, or to an AI tool provider somewhere else, or to some other player's learning loop, and so on, right? And so that is a really profound shift that we haven't yet come to terms with. But whether it's with what happened with, platforms, or what's happening with AI right now, what's common across all of this is that we're increasingly confronted with structural uncertainty. And structural uncertainty, very simply put, is that the game itself is in question. The playing field is in question. You're no longer working within the rules of the game. You're no longer playing with uncertainty within the game. The game itself is uncertain. And so that is where the real advantage, and this is the key idea of my next book, which I term Unfair Advantage, the real source of advantage comes by setting the new playing field, defining the new playing field, and defining the game within it in a way that everybody has to follow and start playing your game. An example to illustrate this is what happened with Reliance, which is an oil and gas company in India, moving into telecom with Reliance Jio. So Reliance moved into Reliance Jio with this technological shift that happened when India went from 3G to 4G. They were the first mover, invested in 4G infrastructure, and overnight they commoditized voice and data. They made it almost free, and through that amassed 400 million users over a period of 3 to 4 years. Now, the reason that was so interesting was that the traditional telco model was invest a lot in infrastructure and make money on voice and data. And suddenly the lions had commoditized the cash cow, right? Now the telcos who were competing, or the incumbent telcos, Reliance is also a 100-plus-year-old company, or it's a very traditional company, if you will. So it's not an AI native startup coming from somewhere and doing all of this. But they were thinking in terms of structural uncertainty. The telcos that saw this, they thought of this in terms of operational uncertainty. They felt, well, the game is supposed to be the same. And now the Reliance is basically starting a price war. So they started engaging in a price war, which was fundamentally misreading the whole game, because what Reliance was trying to do was commoditize data and voice, through that amass an audience and move that audience into higher value added services over which you own the central choke point, because all of them are coming to you through commoditized data and voice. And that essentially moved the industry from some 17 or 20 players to really 2 or 3 big players overnight, because everybody who read that as playing the same old game but running a price war, all of them went out of business or had to consolidate. And a few rivals like Airtel, who initially read it wrong, but then realized what the real game was and then changed their game to play the structural game as well, they succeeded and they've played on. So that's a really interesting example of, you're no longer in the traditional telco industry. You fundamentally changed the game. You fundamentally changed the playing field, because you're no longer just selling voice and data. You're going into e-commerce, you're going into content, you're now competing with Netflix, Amazon, and Facebook, Amazon, Google. Everybody's investing in you. So you've changed both the playing field and the game at the same time. And so that's the distinction of what I call a rule maker versus a rule taker. Rule takers are constantly moving from transient advantage to transient advantage to transient advantage, because they're taking the rules of anybody who's willing to set them. That's the rule takers. But the rule makers have the ability to corner a certain arena, capture that, and then keep coding there or keep expanding beyond that, as long as they continue making the rules. But as we see with, it's not traditional competition anymore, but at the same time, today's rule makers can become tomorrow's rule takers as well. So it's constant reinvention. Google seeing OpenAI coming up, rule maker had to take rules for some time, and now it's trying to figure out how to make the new rules as well. So that's really the distinction that I feel most companies miss, which really explains a lot of what's happening today.
One of the fun stories to me is how Reliance Jio got going. And I'm told that the daughter of the founder had been in New York and was attending university. But he came back to India and said, "Why is our service so awful compared to what we've got in other parts of the world?" Which I thought was a very human aspect to that story.
I'm sure it would have triggered over there. Yeah.
Rita, from your perspective there, if you're going to understand rule making, rule taking, firstly you have to almost unbundle yourself and understand your capabilities, where you've built capabilities itself, which is kind of like an inventory of sorts. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you both was this: and the way I'm going to do this is actually going to illustrate with a brilliant image I use in my own workshops, which is the following. So you can see it on the screen there. For those just listening, because most of the show are listeners, it's a giraffe as an artist painting a woman who's wearing an orange hat. And the artist has created a brilliant version of what they can see. The giraffe is the artist. They're looking head down onto the woman, which is all they've painted is essentially an orange dot on the page. Now, the woman's going to be disappointed when she sees that, kind of like when you go to Paris and you get your portrait painted and it's terrible for €10. But from your own perspective, if you were to look at your work through the lens of someone else and say, this is where people challenge my work, how would you articulate that? So, Rita, your work, say, for example, competitive advantage, then to transient advantage, and some people would go, no, there's moats to be had, or there's a long-term advantage to be had. Where would you see that? And then, Sangeet, I'm going to come to you yourself. So this is what I'm saying, that I see a lot of this kind of people arguing their perspective, which is perfectly right from your perspective. But I'd love you to, in a way, if you had somebody challenging it, to go, here's what they challenge and here's what I say.
Sure. Well, Roger Martin and I debate this all the time. And we actually had a series in HBR where I think Roger's article was entitled something like "Competitive Advantages, Habitual Advantages Last Forever." And my counterpoint to that was, old habits die hard, but they do die. So there's a whole group of people who are still very wedded to the traditional frameworks of strategy. So there are people even today who will say Michael Porter's five forces is the way to understand where you are in competition. So for those that don't know it, basically what Michael Porter did was brilliant, right? What he said was, if you want to understand how a company is going to make big fat profits, you need to create the company equivalent of a monopoly. So what you want is power over your buyers and suppliers. You want to be unique, so there are no substitutes. You want low levels of rivalry, and you want high barriers to entry, right? Well, Sangeet, you tell me, is Google, Apple, Samsung buyers, suppliers, rivals, substitutes, all of the above? So to me, that framework, it operates very well in a specific set of boundary conditions. And more of our economy has nothing to do with those boundary conditions. So, my argument with folks is we're really looking at, if you look at the balance sheets of most large companies in 1975, you would have had something like 93% of the assets on those books would have been tangible assets. So plant, property, equipment, inventory, you name it. If you took the same slice of companies in our economy today and looked at it in 2026, it would be completely flipped. It would be something like 93, 94% intangible. So intellectual property, software, patents, things that you cannot drop on your foot. And so if we're talking about strategy designed for an era in which it was things you could drop on your foot versus strategy today, which is about network effects and value from connection and, things that used to be physical things being replaced completely. I'll give you a concrete example. So there's a company in Israel called Bina AI, and they developed this application which can use a phone to get vital signs. So in the past, if you wanted to get, say, life insurance, you would go to a doctor, you'd get blood drawn, the blood would go to a lab, the lab would analyze it using chemicals, the chemicals would give a certain reading, then somebody expert would read it, they'd say what it was, then the results would go to an actuary who would then give you a price and say, okay, this is how much it's going to cost us, for us to insure you, right? That's the way it used to be. Bina, you start your application on the phone. You get to the point where you need to submit your vital signs. What you literally do is you hold the phone up to your face and you circle your face a few times with the light from the phone, doing just under your skin analysis of your vital signs. And I think they're up to 15 vital signs. Then no actuary, the results of that thing go to an AI built into the app. It runs through its calculations, which it's been taught to do, and it gives you a price right then and there in 2 seconds. So no blood draw, no lab, no chemicals, no reading, no actuary, all that disappears. So when people say to me, oh, 5 forces, you tell me how that's even relevant in an example like that. It's a completely different solution to basically the same problem. So I always try to understand when people criticize my work, which I'm always open to. You can always learn something. I try to really understand what boundary conditions they're coming from. And very often they're just operating with a very different frame of reference than I would be.
And that's why I found, Sangeet, your definition of the whole idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, but it depends on what uncomfortable means to you as an organization. I think it's a huge challenge in life when you come across arguments all the time. Like, my wife just thinks I take way too many risks, and I'm like, what's the big deal? But we have totally different settings of what comfort and what risk is. And that has a huge determination on how you see things and how you measure things and how you go forward. Sangeet, the same question to you, that idea of when you're looking from perspective, where do people come at you in a way, or maybe the most common way, because somebody always does?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are 2 or 3 things. First is that I welcome other perspectives just from the perspective of all models are wrong, but some are useful. So let's start with that. And then let's try to figure out what are your assumptions, what are your first principles, what are the first principles based on which you are creating your model? Because the problem is that people argue using models, and those models, to Rita's point, have assumptions underneath which are not very explicit. And so the models emit answers like, this is right, that is wrong, this is the way to think about it. But if you really have a more fundamental conversation about what the assumptions are underneath, and you reason it out through first principles, that gives a much richer conversation. And so anybody coming in and disagreeing is open to doing that. We've always figured out a way to identify where we are seeing things in a fundamentally different way. It's difficult to argue out the models. It's much easier to figure out from first principles what you are looking at differently, right? But the third thing that I want to say is probably the most important, and that is this, that a lot of the criticism on a model is on what the receiver understands of the model, not on, they don't go into figuring out what the principles underneath are, why the model was created that way. And that happens because there's a lot of silver bullet thinking going on. So use take the idea of a platform or take the idea of a reshuffle. All of these are packaged concepts because packaged concepts are easier to understand. There's a specific boundary. It can fit in a book. It can fit in a keynote. And so people then get wedded to as absorbing that packaged concept. But what's important is both understanding what the assumptions are and, much more importantly, understanding what the dynamics are, because the packaged concept only contains the statics. I'll just talk about, two ways to think about dynamics, which are really important today, right? So first, I talked about structural uncertainty outside in what's happening to the firm. If the playing field was stable, as was traditionally the case, then the assumptions of the playing field and how you get advantage and which positions are advantages versus not, where can a distributor have more power versus a supplier have more power, all of that was very straightforward. But if the playing field is the object of strategy, and if every firm is then pursuing actions that are changing the state of the playing field, that means that the dynamics are more important than the statics. You have to constantly understand and monitor how the rules of competition are changing in response to the moves that individual firms are actively taking. So it's no longer bargaining power of buyers, bargaining power of suppliers, substitutes. None of that matters. What matters is who's changing, who's making what moves, and how is that changing the playing field that you are operating in. It's no longer bilateral power. It's everybody working on the playing field and the playing field putting pressure back on you. So understanding that is dynamics. I'll take another example of dynamics, which is more inside out, right? It's very easy to say that, hey, that's an AI native firm, and this is not an AI native firm. This firm has adopted AI, this has not. But if you really think about what AI does to a firm, it creates a constantly evolving capability set. The reason I say that is because there are three vectors through which this constant evolution happens. First, AI capability in itself constantly evolves because with every new model, we're extending what that capability can do, a certain capability, right? Then the second thing is that there's an adoption and diffusion element to it, which is the extent to which it is being adopted in the firm and becoming a usable capability for the firm. So even if Anthropic or OpenAI launch new capabilities, they become usable inside the firm only once they're adopted in a certain way. And the third is, as these capabilities get adopted, the people who are using AI or who are in the firm, they constantly try to rethink what they should be doing. And so they're evolving the capabilities that they can offer to the firm. So if you really think about the firm, there's a dynamic playing field because everybody is making a different choice and impacting the field. And there's a dynamic capability set because it's constantly evolving with this constantly shifting division of what humans do, what machines do, and how everybody is reimagining their work around it. And so the goal of the firm is to figure out how to marry those two things. And if you think of those in terms of statics, where you say, okay, we need an AI strategy, and you know what? We need a strategy for horizontal AI coming in, and we need a strategy for our suppliers coming into our business. Those are all statics. And so a lot of the criticism to any model happens because in a world which should be understood through dynamics, people are arguing it on the basis of statics. That's been my experience.
About it, you remind me of the Heraclitus quote that no one ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and they're not the same man or woman.
Right.
But I always think about this as the way the world continually changes, where it's almost like jumping into a moving train, and inside the moving train, there's a conveyor belt, and you're trying to land on one of those wobble boards to strengthen your ankle. And the train is on a boat that's going down a waterfall. So everything's moving, and it's not all moving in the same direction either. But one of the things just both of you alluded to is this, is that you talked about the individual there, Sangeet. The individual in the age of AI, and I see this as a real threat, I wrote about this today, is that we're also using AI to try and understand what to do in an age of AI. And by not actually going through the struggle of the work, and by that mean reading the papers, reading the books, studying the work, we lose that ability and the organization loses that ability. And there's going to be a very few people who actually can attend to actually understand this work. And we're going to outsource all that thinking to the LLMs. And there's nobody actually making the strategy anymore. And it's a real danger because already I find it really hard to understand how a CEO or a strategist within inside a company is getting the time to actually study work, to understand all these different frames, to understand all these different lenses, to see things differently. Because if they have to do that and they still have to deliver and they still have to lead people and develop people, where do they get the time to learn? And time needs to be carved out for the learning. And in times like, Rita, I saw you recently wrote about the MIT Sloan Review being shut down. When we need it probably most in the world, like this is a real challenge. And I just thought we'd share a thought from you both on that challenge that we're seeing on a human level, regardless of strategy, the ability to attend and to actually do the strategy work.
I think that's really a question of discipline and prioritization. Work will expand to occupy all the time you allocate to it. And so if I give somebody half an hour to solve a problem or have a negotiation or do a thing, it'll get done in half an hour. If I give them 2 hours, it'll take the 2 hours. So I think the first issue that I see in companies is just very poor prioritization and clarity around what's on the agenda and what's not. So it's like peanut butter, right? It's a little bit of everything all at once. And so this argument that I'm making about strategic centering is it should really inform your agenda. And I've said for years that if something's important to you, so let's say it's innovation or it's strategy or it's whatever, I want to be able to look at your agenda, which is what's on your meeting list, how you spend your time, who you're with in meetings. And I want to see that visibly represented as item number 1, 2, or 3. So if you start from there and say, this is not a nice to have that I'll squeeze in when other pressures leave me. But if you said, this is the most important thing I do. For example, Vasna Narasimhan, who's the CEO of Novartis, has a great phrase, which I really love. He said he sees his primary job as directing the energy of the organization. And he's a scientist. I mean, he's an enormously capable person. But that leadership role that he's got is directing the organizational energy. So that's one. The other thing that I think is true is we just take on a lot of stuff, and we are not judicious about what we can stop doing and what we believe to be important or not. So, a friend of mine, Sharon Price John, who was the CEO of Build-A-Bear Workshop and is now taking on that role at Carter's, has this great phrase. She calls it SDSS times 2. And the first SDSS is stop doing stupid stuff. And if you think about it, over time, any organization accumulates stuff, habits, processes, approvals. I read somewhere that at Harvard, they're doing this exercise right now, and that it took 67 steps to hire somebody. 67 completely different processes to hire somebody. Well, so get rid of that stuff. So that'll clear a lot of bandwidth. And then the second SDSS is start doing smart stuff. But until you get the deck cleared of the stupid stuff that's no longer relevant, you're not going to have the bandwidth to do the new things. So I think that's just a point of discipline, and making choices is hard. But hey, if you got the top job, that's what you're getting paid for.
And Sangeet, what's your take?
Yeah. I'm going to compliment what Rita shared. I'm going to look at it from a different angle of what has been my personal experience, sort of thinking about my work as, I've started using AI. So one of the key things that I believe is important is to make a distinction between, are you working for the model or is the model working for you, right? I mean, at the extreme, it's the distinction that I make between an Uber data scientist and a Uber driver, where the Uber data scientist is, structuring the algorithm and the Uber driver is essentially working for the algorithm. But, in a different way, it applies to a lot of knowledge work that we do. We sort of collapse all of it in this fuzzy word called augmentation. Just because you use the tool doesn't mean you're using it right. So the way I think about it is that if most of my time is spent in generating AI output and then correcting and fixing it and making it usable for myself. I'm really working for the model. I'm not making the model work for me. And in order for what that has then helped me, forced me to think about is, how do I make the model work for me? How do I provide it sufficient context? How do I think about creating a framework and a structure where I don't have to keep providing it context every time? And there have been different ways of going about it. I've worked on creating a knowledge graph that brings together all of my research, links it to other research that's interesting, and then I always start the model by querying the knowledge graph first before I start looking at any problems. So it starts with my lens. Otherwise, if it's generic answers that I'm retrofitting into my lens, that's just a lot of wasted work. So that's one thing, I'm constantly looking at, am I working for the model or is the model working for me? And that's something that's happening in a lot of professions today. Take the example of translation. The moment you think large language models, you think that translators are out of a job. And clearly, both the translation companies and their clients think that way. So what's happening with translators is that translators are stuck verifying and correcting AI translation, whereas very often it's faster for them to translate the document themselves. But they are not just spending double the time doing this, they're also being paid half the money to do this, because everybody assumes that AI is doing all of the work. But translation is not just mapping of language, it's understanding of context, it's understanding of risk, what should be managed in what way. And if the translator is fixing AI output, the easy part has been done by AI. The harder part, for which their neck is on the line, is what they have to do, but now they have to do it in a workflow that is not familiar to them. So that's the distinction of working for the model versus the model working for you. The other piece that is I've kind of always tried to think about is, and again, what you wrote in your article resonates a lot, right? So always thinking about, am I just being fluent because I've got enough output to deal with and to work with, and some slides are looking good because Claude Code designed them? Or do I actually understand this in a way that I can tear it apart and rethink about it in different ways? And again, new ways of thinking about how you provide context to the model has helped me figure that out. The final point is, going back to statics versus dynamics. If I'm talking about Reshuffle, and I'm going to be going and giving answers that are statics, which is, here's how I believe your industry is, things are playing out, and here's what this means for you. By the time I do the analysis and I present it 2 weeks later, the playing field has changed again. So clearly that is not the right way to do it. So what I'm trying to do right now, I mean, it's still an experiment, but what I'm hoping to do is to move the work from statics to dynamics. So I'm working on creating an index where I essentially use AI as a monitoring mechanism, where agents can constantly figure out what are the moves that companies are making on a daily basis, bring them back in. But what I do is I curate the central lens in a deep way, where every move informs the lens and the lens informs how the move should be evaluated. So yeah, that's been my big personal project this year that I've been working on, and I'm hoping to bring it out in the next 2 months. So that's those are some ways that I'm thinking about, how do you preserve your edge in an age where not just the tools are getting better, but the way people think the tools are getting better is actually outpacing how good the tools are, because people just assume that everything is being solved by the tool, but it's not.
And speaking of which, Rita, you've just written another brilliant article for Harvard Business Review. I'll link to that because you continue going to the mind gym, just like Sangeet alluded to. For both of you, where is the best place to find you? Rita, where is the best place people can find your writing, your books, etc.?
RitaMcGrath.com will sort of be the central hub. I have a regular podcast, as you know, and publish regular articles on Substack and Medium and on LinkedIn.
And I'll link to those. And Sangeet, for people who want to find you, where's the best place?
Yeah, you can go to reshufflebook.com and platforms.substack.com for my newsletter.
It's always a pleasure. I always learn with witnesses with you two guys. It's been an absolute pleasure learning from you today. Rita McGrath and Sangeet Paul Choudary, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks as always to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. And don't forget the Kyndryl Institute. You'll find Rita, you'll find Sangeet, you'll find many more brilliant thinkers on there. Kyndryl.com/institute. See you next week.